This is an important story that we want to tell tonight. And I want to do it as a story. It is a painful story. It's a story that can make us feel ashamed about what we as human beings are capable of. It is also a story about deep faith. It's the story of a woman who found incredible courage because of her religious beliefs. Sojourner Truth was an evangelist more than she ever was an abolitionist or an advocate for women's rights or an advocate for her race. And she did all of that with 150% of her effort. So I need you to remember that. She was also illiterate. Yet she quoted scripture word for word and was eloquent in her own raw-boned way. She's an important figure in American history, and she's buried in our state of Michigan, in Battle Creek. So this is a different kind of slide presentation or PowerPoint than I normally do. There are no words. It's a story we want to hear tonight. So we begin at the beginning. And John, can you we'll have Tim, just a couple of the lights in the back. Can you hit that one switch? We're going to begin in 1797 in New York, in Swartkill in Ulster County. It's important for us to remember that in 1797, slavery was legal in the state of New York. Slaves were bought and sold. The traffic was just as brisk as it was in the South. Mama Bet and James Bomfrey were Isabella's parents. She was known as Isabella Bomfrey for most of her young life. She was one of 13 children. She didn't know most of her brothers and sisters because they were sold off, ripped from their mother and father long before she was born. She was almost the youngest. Her first language was Dutch. This was Dutch New York. Her parents were favored slaves of Johannes Hardenberg. He even gave them a little plot of land out behind his big farm where they could raise a little tobacco, a little grain, a little vegetable to help augment what they had, which was literally nothing. Johannes died when Isabella was just a baby, and his son, Charles, then became the master of the entire family, as they were all slaves. This is a picture of Ulster County, probably the way Isabella would have remembered it when she was just a little girl. Now, Charles Hardenberg, as it went, was probably a rather compassionate slave owner, but yet this was the kind of house, the kind of shelter that all of his slaves lived in. Altogether, there were at least between 7 and 9, depending on how many children were involved at the time. They lived in the cellar. There were loose, rough planks for floor, but there was muddy, wet mud and water underneath. It was damp, it was wet. Fever sores, rheumatism, aches, chilblains, fever were common for all the slaves that lived in that damp cellar. The only light they had was through a few panes of glass, and it was sort of reflected light. They lit it by lighting, or they had additional light by burning a pine knot. He beat them. That was common. They were property. They were not human beings. Mama Baumfried used to cry a lot because she remembered her other children who had been taken from her. Her 5-year-old son, her 3-year-old daughter, were packed off into a sleigh and dragged away from her. And so she took Isabella and her little brother Peter, and she would talk to them about her brothers and sisters at night when they could go out and look at the stars. She taught them about God sitting outside. And Isabella recalled that she would say, "My children, there is a God who hears you." And they would say, "A God, Mama? Where does he live?" "He lives in the sky," she replied. "And when you are beaten or cruelly treated or fall into any trouble, you must ask help of him, and he will always hear you and help you." She taught them the Lord's Prayer and entreated them, "Don't lie, don't steal, try and obey your master." She was preparing them because she knew they would be ripped away from her too. She'd say, "Those are the same stars, and that is the same moon that look down on your brothers and sisters. And they see it, and they look up at them, even though they are far away from us and from each other." When Charles Hardenberg died, Isabella was 9. His property was inventoried, and that's a copy of the inventory. And if you look, there is a line that says, "Isabella, $100. She was torn away from her mother and father, and she was sold, as was her brother. Mama and old James, known as Baumfried, Baumfried meant tree in Dutch. He was tall and strong like a tree when he was young, but now he was old and crippled and losing his sight, and he couldn't work anymore. And he had lived in that damp cellar for so long. He wasn't worth a penny. And so they gave Mama her freedom so somebody could take care of him. But Isabella and her brother were sold. She was sold to John Neely, who was English, for $100. And by the way, that $100 also bought some sheep. They treated her cruelly because she only spoke Dutch. She didn't understand when they said, "Go fetch the frying pan. Go peel the potatoes." And try as she might, she displeased them, and so they beat her unmercifully. Once with rods, metal rods tied together with rope that had been heated in a fire. She only saw her mother 3 or 4 times before her mother died, still living in the cellar, taking care of her father. She was not geographically that far removed from them. She had just been sold to another farm in the area, another master. But her mother died, and now there was no one to take care of Baumfried, so he sort of went from farm to farm if someone would give him shelter. He came to see his daughter, and she begged him to help her find a better place to live. And apparently he was able to convince a local fisherman, who was also an innkeeper, to purchase her for $105. So she was only with the Neelys for about 18 months. Martinus Shriver had her work hard. She carried fish, she hoed corn, she collected herbs and roots to help make beer for his tavern. He treated her better than the Neelys did, but he was a very crude man, and so by the time she was 12, she could swear very well. In 1810, she was sold again to John Dumont for $175. And during this period, because Mama was dead and there was no one to take care of her father, he froze to death, completely abandoned. Mr. Dumont was a fairly decent man. The cruelty for the next 16 years came from Mrs. Dumont, who was harsh and cruel, and has happened more often than most people know. She sexually abused Isabella. Isabella, in her narrative, doesn't talk about it directly, but from reading other manuscripts based on other women slaves, historians believe that this was the case. In 1815, when Isabella was about 18 years old, she did what most young women do. She fell in love. She fell in love with another slave named Robert, who was owned by a different man named either Catlin or Canton. The records aren't quite clear. He forbade the relationship because if she had children by Robert, they would belong to Dumont, not to Catlin. He didn't want his slave creating additional slaves for his neighbor. So he forbade the relationship. Keep in mind, slaves were not allowed to marry legally anyway. They might have had ceremonies, but they were not sanctioned by the government or any church. Robert tried to sneak in to see Isabella once when she was sick with fever. The slave owner and his son found out about it, got a hold of Robert, and beat him so severely about the head and face. The document said his face was mangled. He never came back to see Isabella again. Dumont pressured her to take a husband to marry an older slave named Thomas when she was about 20 years old. The records indicate that Diana, her firstborn, was probably Robert's child. Diana was born shortly after Robert stopped coming to visit her. Peter, born in 1822, an infant son, James, who died, Elizabeth, who was born in 1825, and Sophia in 1826, were all children between Thomas and Isabella. Another important thing to remember at this time was that New York was changing its law. The state of New York had decided to emancipate all of its slaves on the 4th of July in 1827. Certainly the slaves knew this. Mr. Dumont had a good relationship with Isabella because she had grown into such a good and hard worker. She was 6 feet tall. I think she probably resembled her father. She had a deep, resonant voice. She was all sinew and muscle, and she worked and worked and worked. So Dumont promised Isabella freedom in 1826, 1 year before emancipation was mandated by law, if she did well and remained faithful to him. But she injured her hand working in the fields, apparently quite severely. It was permanently crippled. So he reneged. He said, "Oh, I didn't get enough work out of you. You'll have to wait a year." Isabella was not only strong physically, she was a smart woman, and she had a strong will. And she said, "No, I have worked plenty hard for you." To make sure that she felt she had fulfilled her commitment, she spun 100 pounds of wool and decided it was time to leave. And she prayed, as her mother had taught her, when do I go? How do I go? Not in the middle of the night, because I can't see. Not in the daytime, because my owner will see me leave. So she got up about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning when she knew the sun was coming. And she took that infant daughter, Sophia, and she walked away. She said, I did not run off, for I thought that wicked. I walked off, believing that was all right. She walked and she walked, and she sat down to feed her child, and she prayed to God because she didn't know where to go. And then she remembered a man named Levi Rowe who might help her. And so she walked the path to Levi's house. And he said, you know what? If you go over there, down that way, there's a Quaker family, the Van Wagners, and they'll probably help you. So she continued to walk on that path well into the daylight. No one saw her. She believed God was with her. And she arrived at this house, which still stands, owned by Maria and Isaac Van Wagner. And she told them what she had done. She told them she deserved freedom. And they asked her in, and they fed her, and they gave her a bed to sleep in. Isabella had never seen a bed with pillows and blankets and clean sheets. And she thought it so beautiful and so fine that she didn't deserve to sleep in it, so she slept under it on the floor. Now, she hadn't run very far, and she did that on purpose because she didn't want to displease Mr. Dumont too much. So within a very short period of time, he found her. He came after her. And he said, Isabella, you ran away. And she said, no, sir, I walked away in the daylight because you promised me a year of my time. And he said, you have to come back. And she said, I won't come back. And he said, then I'll take your child. And she said, no, you won't. The Quaker stood forward. How much is the rest of her year worth? He asked. $20. $5 for the child. The child was an infant. I will pay it. So he bought Isabella's freedom and gave her a job. And then he turned to Isabella and she said, thank you, master. And he said, you are not to call me master. I am Isaac Van Wagner, and my wife is Maria Van Wagner. That is what you call us. And so in many books, she is known as Isabella Van Wagner. She learned while she was living with the Van Wagners and working for them, because they hired her, that Dumont had sold her 5-year-old son, Peter, sold him to Dr. Gedney, who lived in the state. Gedney sent the boy, when he found out he was too little to do anything, to his brother Solomon, and Solomon sold Peter to his brother-in-law, Mr. Fowler, who lived in Alabama. That was illegal. You could not sell a slave out of New York when the slave lived in New York. And Isabella went to Mrs. Dumont and complained and said, how dare you sell my son, and you can't sell him out of the state. She brushed it off. Who would care about your brat? Just go make another one. She went to Solomon's mother, the mother-in-law of Mr. Fowler in Alabama, who was married to her daughter, Eliza. And she complained bitterly. And Solomon's mother said, What are you worried about your baby? I lost my daughter. She's in Alabama. Go away. Isabella never gave up. A friend directed her to some activist Quakers who gave her money and helped her plead her case to the grand jury. The story gets involved. It took months, but Isabella got her son back. When her son was brought to her, he was screaming and kicking and wailing to stay with his good master, that he didn't know that woman. He had been with the new master in Alabama less than 2 years, but he denied his own mother. Yet, she was given him, and when she took him home and undressed him, he was covered with welts and bruises and the marks of whips. And she said, "Lord, render unto them double for this." And he admitted he remembered her. But it's interesting, the relationship between a slave owner and a slave. It's this warped relationship of loyalty and cruelty that's hard for us to understand even today. The odd part of the story is that within a few months of this occurring, Mr. Fowler brutally murdered his wife, Eliza. And Isabella was in the room when Eliza's mother heard that her daughter had been murdered. This was the same woman who had brushed Isabella off. And Isabella, who had prayed to God, render double unto them, said, "I dare not find fault with God, but I didn't mean you to do that much." Peter was permanently changed, had a relationship with his mother, but had difficulty with everyone else, was known to get in trouble for a long, long time. Now, what's really important at this point in the story is to remember that I started by saying that Isabella is remembered first and foremost as an evangelist. Her mission in life was revealed to her while she was living with the Van Wagners. Once a year, well, twice a year, on Pentecost and at Christmas, slave owners allowed the slaves to have a break, to have a festival. It bred loyalty. It was a pressure release. And Pentecost came, and it was known by the Dutch as Pinkster in their language. And it was this riotous celebration full of not very respectable behavior that the slaves got involved in. There was some eating, there was a lot of lovemaking, there was dancing. It was a real bawdy festival. And despite the fact that Isabella truly enjoyed working for the Van Wagners and was free, she missed the relationship with the slaves that she had lived with so long. She longed to go back and be part of Pinkster. And she told the Van Wagners Dumont was going to come, and she was going to go back to her old slave home to celebrate Pinkster with her son. Well, Dumont pulled up his wagon. Isabella said she remembered walking up to the wagon, and then all of a sudden, she said she saw an enormous, powerful God surrounding her. Powerful to the point of anger, completely overwhelming. And she said, "Oh God, I did not know you were so big." And she ran back into the house, and she never went to Pinkster. According to her narrative, very soon after that, she then felt a presence between her and God. And she describes it as bright and beautiful, holy and radiant, full of love. She was confused, she was overwhelmed, and then she said she knew exactly what that presence was. It was Jesus. And she said the love of Jesus became her focus. And with that love, she said, "Lord, I can even love them white folks." That's amazing. She said that she saw Jesus first as a friend who stood between her and God. And then as she learned more from Scripture, remember, this was a woman who could not read. She had to go by what she heard. She became aware that other people believed in Jesus. She was not alone. And her concept of Jesus did become more elevated and spiritual, and sometimes she even spoke of him as God. But this was one woman's own personal evolution of faith. In 1829, she left Ulster County and she moved to New York with an evangelical teacher named Miss Gear. And this is where she established her reputation as a preacher. At this time in history, there was a movement known as the Second Great Awakening. It was a time of revivals, of accepting Jesus as your personal Savior, of not relying on the church, of self-identity. And she met a man named Eliza Pearson, who was an advocate of following the Old Testament very strictly, and his house was the kingdom. It was very much a cult. And she worked for Pearson and became his housekeeper, his spiritual equal, and a preacher. A man named Richard Matthews, who then became known as Richard Matthias, moved into the house and took it over. He was a very powerful person who had his own cult, his own beliefs, and we will find this throughout history. He believed that God owned everything, God owns all, but he was empowered by God, and therefore he owned everything. Women were very subservient, or should be very subservient in his beliefs. You did the work and you were submissive sexually. Whatever woman a man wanted, he could take. It got very strange in this kingdom. And in 1834, Pearson died and the group was disbanded. And there were accusations that Matthias and Isabella had stolen from Pearson and poisoned him. They were acquitted of all charges. And actually, Isabella was granted a small amount of money in a slander lawsuit against her. Very soon after this, her son Peter was taken as a seaman on a whaling ship, the Zone, out of Nantucket. Over the course of 5 years, Isabella received 5 letters from him. He had learned to read and write, or someone had written for him. The Zone came back, but Peter was never seen again. No one knows what happened to him. In 1843, at the age of 46, Isabella changed her name. She became Sojourner, a woman who traveled to preach. And she took on the last name Truth because that's what God told her to do. Sojourner Truth. The script you see at the bottom is the only evidence we have that she ever learned to sign her name, Sojourner. In 1844, she became involved with the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, in Massachusetts. It was another utopian community of 210 members. They lived on 500 acres. They had a farm, a grist mill, a sawmill, and a silk factory. They were funded by abolitionists. They believed in cooperative and productive labor. They did not believe in slavery. They were religiously tolerant. They supported women's rights, and they were pacifists. All of these things lined up with Sojourner Truth's beliefs. What's interesting is this is where she met William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and David Ruggles, who we all know from history books were so important to the abolition movement. Unfortunately, the silk factory failed, and the group was disbanded in debt in 1846. For a while then, we have to remember there were periods of time Sojourner had to support herself. And she oftentimes worked as a day laborer or as a housekeeper. She was very, 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 very thrifty, and she lived on pennies. But she was able, between 1846 and 1850, to buy a home for $300. And also, this is the period of time when she dictated her narrative, her biography, to a woman named Olive Gilbert. I've read the narrative. It's a very interesting read, but you have to read through it because Olive is very, very dominant, the voice in there, interpreting what Sojourner said. So you have to look at the bits and pieces that are Sojourner and then the bits and pieces that Olive thinks you need to know. However, what we do know is that Sojourner made money off of her narrative. She sold it along with her picture wherever she went to preach. And she was such a compelling speaker with this big, tall woman with this deep, booming voice that people loved to hear her message. And she talked about women's rights, and she talked about how awful slavery was, and she gave her personal testimony of how she had come to know Jesus. In 1854, Sojourner went to the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. And this is when she gave a very important speech, commonly referred to as "Ain't I a Woman?" Now, we don't know if she said this word for word, but as it's related, she sat in this church for hours listening to men speak, saying why women shouldn't have rights, that they were delicate flowers, that they were not smart enough, they couldn't work hard enough, they had to be helped in and out of carriages, they had to be treated gently, so they couldn't be treated as a man's equal. And after these men had spoken, she got up, and this is what she said. "Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? And I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out in my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Someone shouted, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights and Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, Wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man over there in black, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up. And now they's asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. In 1858, when she was 61 years old, she got involved with a spiritualism religious movement. It was an offshoot of the Progressive Friends, which was part of a group of Quakers. They were once again against slavery. They were for women's rights, and they also believed in communicating with spirits. But Sojourner, her entire life, felt she had a very direct line of communication with Jesus. She sold her house in Northampton, and she bought one in Harmonia, Michigan, not very far away from Battle Creek. She continued to travel and to preach. And during this period, she also went to Silver Lake in Indiana. And when she was at a meeting, she was accused of being a man. She solved that question by opening her blouse and exposing her breasts. During the Civil War, her grandson, James Caldwell, served in the 54th Regiment out of Massachusetts. She worked with freed slaves in a refugee camp in Virginia, and following the war, she worked with the National Freedoms Relief Association in Washington, D.C. Keep in mind, she was 67 years old at the time. She also met President Lincoln while she was working in Washington. This very famous picture of her with Lincoln, the story goes, Lincoln is showing her the Lincoln Bible, which was given to him by African Americans who lived in Baltimore, Maryland. At this same time, 1863, 1864, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a romanticized essay about her, which is available online, called Libyan Sybil. I suggest you read it. It's wonderful. When she was in her 70s, she started to slow down. She developed ulcers on her legs. And her last great trip was in 1879. She spent 1 year in Kansas. She was jubilant about freed slaves who moved out west and settled there as freed men. And that's why she went to work with them there. She also came back and she moved to Battle Creek directly. She sold her little house in Harmonia. She moved to Battle Creek. And in 1883, the ulcers came back on her legs, and they must have been very, very bad. She was actually treated by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who at that time had a thriving sanitarium in Battle Creek. There is some evidence that he actually grafted his own skin onto Sojourner Truth to try and heal the ulcers on her legs. However, she continued to decline, and Sojourner Truth died at her home with her daughters Diana and Eliza and their families with her. She died on November 26, 1883 at 3 o'clock in the morning. She was 86 years old. She was buried on November 28th in Battle Creek. 1,000 people attended her memorial. This dispatch by telegram was delivered on November 27th from Frederick Douglass. In the death of Sojourner Truth, a marked figure has disappeared from the earth. Venerable for age, distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devotion to the welfare of her race, she has been for the last 40 years an object of respect and admiration to social reformers everywhere. And that is the story of Sojourner Truth. Thank you.